Well, it's day 13 of the lockdown in South Africa, and it comes with very, very harsh restrictions that is having a major impact on business as well. President Cyril Ramaphosa is yet to decide on whether the 21-day lockdown will be extended. Let's discuss this now with business and find out how it is coping during this time. Business Unity South Africa's Vice President, Martin Kingston, joins us via Skype from Johannesburg. Mr. Kingston, thanks for your time. Firstly, if the lockdown is extended by the President, there's been some pretty grim predictions that we may lose about 1.6 million jobs. That's just in the formal sector of the economy.
Well, we need to anticipate that there's going to be significant economic fallout as a consequence of the lockdown. There's a trade-off between the public health care considerations and the humanitarian imperative and the damage immediately and over a long term to the economy. But there's no doubt that the lockdown is going to have immediate and long-term ramifications, not just for unemployment in the formal and indeed the informal sector, as you say, but also for growth in the short term and over the longer term.
Interesting reading a blog from Business Leadership South Africa's CEO or president, that's Cyril Ramaphosa, who was speaking about business operations. She says that key business operations should continue to be allowed to trade, and it's important because it will determine whether or not the recovery sustains.
Well, we're not in a recovery yet. We're going to have to redesign what type of economic trajectory we can get on, which is sustainable, as you say, post the lockdown and indeed post COVID-19. We think that's going to be 12 months before we're going to be able to embark upon that trajectory in a sustainable manner. We need to recognize we're doing this against a backdrop of a recession that was already in place, compounded by 2 downgrades, and of course fundamentally exacerbated by COVID-19. The reality is that we have not yet seen the catastrophe that is likely to be visited upon not only South Africa but by Africa, by COVID-19 over an extended period of time if we're not properly prepared, both from a humanitarian healthcare perspective as well as from an economic perspective.
Which of these key business operations need to keep going, Mr. Kingston, for the economy to not suffer as much?
Well, I need to emphasize that first and foremost, we need to keep our healthcare industry up and running. That is actually the front line. When I talk about healthcare, I talk about the workers, I talk about the support staff, and of course I talk about the supply of pharmaceutical as well as PPE and other associated equipment. Also, the food chain needs to be activated fully. We're working hand in glove with government to ensure that, to distribute food to indeed the most vulnerable in society, in the townships and informal settlements. Over and above that, then we need to look at those sectors of the economy that can be revitalized immediately, that can sustain the economy, the financial services sector, export industries, all the time recognizing the need to maintain social distancing and observing the regulations that have been put in place as a consequence of the lockdown. We don't expect many of those regulations to be removed post the lockdown. They need to remain in place until indeed the virus is contained.
Mr. Kingston, it's interesting you mentioned the healthcare sector that you say needs to keep going. I need to draw your attention to what is happening in the Netcare group. Your assessment of how the CEO there, the group CEO, Dr. Richard Friedland, is handling the situation at Durban's St. Augustine's Hospital.
Well, what are you referring to there? The fact that they've had deaths in the hospital? I think the reality is that unfortunately the infection rate is going to climb. We don't know how steep the curve is going to be. And the reality and the tragedy is that people are going to become very sick and many of them are going to die. We've seen that globally. It's going to happen in South Africa. We hope we can suppress the mortality incidence, of course. It's unfortunate that we've had 3 incidents that I'm aware of at the same hospital, but I think that has absolutely nothing to do with Netcare. All hospitals need to be available to offer the necessary and requisite care to all patients.
Let's talk about the emergency budget that some are saying government needs to have and make sure that money is readily available. How soon should that be made accessible?
Well, we have no doubt that the National Treasury is currently assessing what additional fiscal stimulus needs to be brought to bear. We need to remember that in the budget that the Minister of Finance tabled in February, we were already in very constrained circumstances. Those circumstances have been fundamentally undermined, in fact, by both the downgrade, but more particularly by COVID-19. And we're going to have to see further reallocations to priority areas. We're going to have to see to what extent we can access liquidity both domestically and internationally into the system. The Minister of Finance has already started talking about it, and we as business stand ready to see what endeavours we can put at the disposal of South Africa to ensure that there is both liquidity in the system and we focus on key priorities. But that budget, I think, shouldn't be accelerated until we're able to gauge the size and scale of the impact of COVID-19 on South Africa.
Officials in the Finance Ministry, just as a final question to you, Mr. Kingston, they are very adamant that they're not about to approach international finance institutions for any sort of help except the issues surrounding COVID-19. Is it time yet as a business sector? Do you think it's time that South Africa starts considering approaching the likes of the IMF and World Bank?
No, we think that the strictures that the IMF would impose are strictures that we can impose upon ourselves. We need to take self-help measures. When there's a COVID-19 facility, as the IMF has announced, we must, of course, access it. But all sources of capital, both domestic and international, will have to be evaluated to ensure that we've got access, as I said, to appropriate liquidity for the South African economy.
Thank you very much for your time. Martin Kingston speaks for Business Unity South Africa.